Hello, this is Varn Blog Solo, and today I'm beginning a series of responses to other socialist thinkers on the possibility of socialism in light of the midterms in America and the recent elections across the globe. It is easy to get lost in the minutiae of everyday politics. It is easy even to get even more lost trying to keep up with the permutations of congressional and parliamentary elections and executives across the planet, because as even people in America know, as the single hegemonic power becomes less and less unilateral in its ability to dominate the world, even though no individual power can actually oppose it, as it declines, as all powers seem to be declining with it, we all follow more and more of the planet's politics in the United States. That's a good thing. My audience is not just in the United States, it is primarily in the US, but just barely. But it is a good thing that that is the case. But we get lost in the minutiae here, particularly of midterms. Are the Democratic Socialists doing any better? Why are the Republicans going to win? Despite the fact that the current trends are the same trends that have dominated US political life since the middle of the 1990s. That it has encompassed more than my adult life, and I am aging. Now, those should not surprise us. We can do analysis on that, and I will. I will probably be on This is Revolution several times in the next few days to talk about the implications of the midterms and of this or that election. But there's a bigger issue at stake, and that is the confines of the socialist imagination. An almost contradictory thing has emerged as the Overton window, something that I've never liked as a concept, has moved. Socialism is not scary again, but very few of us agree on what socialism is. And while you have now all kinds of Cold Warrior types who imagine themselves as they've come back from the Somme, while they've never fought a day in their life, or if they did, maybe they served for a few years in Iraq. You have these reactionaries coming back with a vision of collective unity because there is none in their lives, and a vision of community that they propose that never existed for them. But since they realize their own existence, their own privilege is precarious, they turn to scary things. And we socialists perhaps should do the same, because we have gotten ourselves lost in a century of concessions. You see, for all the complaints that someone like me is black-pilled, there is a fundamental belief that I have that people, given relatively equal access to power, keep each other in check and can do collectively what needs to be done. We already do. I've actually seen this in real life. All right. In northern Mexico and in Egypt, communities pretty much run themselves. The state was barely involved. In so much that there was a state, it was to serve particular purposes and to perhaps protect people like a mafia-like exchange racket from outsiders, of which the state itself was probably the one angry. This is not to say that I'm an anarchist. In fact, I am most explicitly not. And I don't even like the term libertarian socialist because I think it's confusing. But my point has always been that my belief in socialism is based off not a hatred of the anarchy of the free market, although I do think that's a problem, but in a fundamental belief that if people are given the right incentives to participate in a system, in a society, they will do so in ways that does not establish strong hierarchies or permanent roles, permanent means of holding power, and that they will, to maintain relative power equality, also accept a lot of self-imposed and deliberative constraints, as long as they have equal input into those outcomes. And yes, there will always be people who don't accept this. And yes, society will have to deal with them. And definitely the people with power and or exclusive access to weapons and or any other privilege definitely don't want to lose those privileges. All right. And I see this every day. Even parents who think that they are doing something good for their children at the expense of society and then continue to push that only do so because they believe that in general there's no good option for everybody to win. Most people are not sociopaths. This brings me to Daniel of What Is Politics recent video. Why is every communist country a dictatorship? And his invocation of Georgy Plekhanov, which I have mentioned before in the Incan development. Now, Plekhanov doesn't actually use that phrase exactly. That's a concept that's taken from him when he talks about the massive capitulation of trying to build large infrastructure very quickly, requiring an authoritarian leader. Whereas when you join up when that already exists, you don't need such leaders. One of the visions that we have today, and one of the problems of this rebirth of socialism as it exists right now, all right, is that we have been blinded by the 21st and 20th century. The 21st century, where we've listened to every conservative faction pretend that any change in the status quo is socialism, that any government good is socialism, that any collective action is socialism. And so much so that even people like David Graeber have internalized that in their responses to it, saying, well, any collective action that we engage in is the communism in our hearts. That's not, that far from what Graeber actually ended up arguing towards the end of his life. No. We have to be more ambitious than that. We lost that ambition, even though we have the technological means for it. Yes, we have become cynical about the internet for good reason, not just in that it has not played out the way we were told by the techno-utopians, but also because it has not been handled in a way that equalizes power between those who contribute to it. And it requires massive amounts of resources to run, which are often done at public expense, of which many parasitic mega millionaires and a lot of the Forbes top 10 these days come from. They're not producers, not even by the old conservative standards of the word. We can say that American culture or European culture, or this is a culture makes this impossible, or that nationalism makes this untenable. Most people are nationalists because other forms of identity have been subsumed for them, and that's all they have left. It's the same reason most people are racialist, right? When all you have is your bare existence, the abstractions you can pull most immediate to you, that things that seem to have some corollary to your biological being, even if they don't, have a lot of pull. Doesn't matter that these are ideological constructions. Doesn't matter that they're not really real. And this actually is something we could learn from pre-modern forms of society and how they constructed identities. But there is other things we have to answer, and it is pathetic that Marxists have to leave it up to we stall on talking about the failure of Marxian societies to be democratic at all, even ones with relatively popular legitimacy, and why they are afraid of that, and how they actually function. In many ways, they function more like liberal institutions that kind of block out the problems of the noise of the public and the bad maladaptive traits of the public under current constraints of power, with building more and more institutions. Whereas Marxism really did want to build a society that was classless, not just in terms of production, but also in terms of power. Go read State and Revolution. Even Lenin talks about having a standing army and implies a class society necessarily. This is something Lenin understood, Trotsky understood, Stalin understood it. He just thought it was necessary, and one sees the rolling back of concessions further and further and further as things move in a direction one did not predict. But Plekhanov predicted it. Now, what does this have to do with us today? Would socialism become popular again? Well, like all these institutions, we lose the forest for the trees. A few more democratic socialists in office means we'll accept all kinds of concessions from the Democrats to keep them in office, even though that we know that centrist Democrats will blame them for whatever negative thing befalls a certain party. Furthermore, we will justify our own moves through such obfuscations, as we see right now with younger millennials and Zoomers picking up very not just anti-liberal but anti-left ideologies, but trying to rebrand them under the mantle of 20th century leftism. Conservatism seems unviable to them. They've never known that ancien regime. But they don't really have our ideas. But this is not just new to Twitter. This is the experience of the 20th century. When the socialist revolutions didn't happen in the developed world, for reasons that are complicated, but mainly had to do with concessions to capital to stop fascism, stop something worse emerging at the beginning of the first major capitalist crisis that was worldwide, the Great Depression, and at the end of the Long Depression, which was all over the United States and Europe. We see that concessions out of these things further and further removed us. First, from optimism at the end of the Long Depression, socialist ideas became more popular, even though we've forgotten it in the United States and indigenous to the United States. These ideas were not completely foreign, even though all the anti-communism of the 20th century was aimed at making them seem so. And as we've revived socialism, we've often pulled from definitions of our enemies to revive it. Socialism is when government does stuff for us. No, socialism is when all of us are equally empowered to make those decisions, and roles like landlord and boss are removed. The democratization of society becomes total, not just formal in certain specific areas of life. We cannot get lost in whatever current left milieu exists as it moves to try to differentiate itself from bourgeois politics without forming any of the things it needed to form to change the situation. The attempt to develop this way makes sense as bourgeois revolutions happened in the 20th century. It's not just ultra leftists. You have to admit that most of these national liberation revolutions ended up being bourgeois revolutions because there was no socialist international order of a major power for which them to join that was fully developed, and the ones that did develop did so by taking a capitalist turn. The capitalist rotors won in almost all instances. And most people defending socialism today are defending that, not the older definitions. Or they're defending the state, the primary organ of bourgeois society. Ironically, for all the rhetoric of libertarianism, the state has always been the organ of bourgeois society, and it is not an organ that has always existed in the way that it exists in capitalist countries. Part of the problems of decolonialization is trying to conceive of how to organize things in societies that were not organized by formal states after formal states have been introduced by colonial powers. Do you use the master's tools or not? Chinua Achebe says you use the master's tools, but what concessions are being made? Now, the Marxist says, of course you use the master's tools, but you have to rebuild them, redirect them. And we have not. No, I'm not blackpilled because I still believe in these things, but I'm also not a believer in shortcuts. We empower everyone or we don't. Yes, I am a class first thinker, but I'm not a class only thinker. I'm not a class reductionist. I don't wear that badge with pride like some people who may consider themselves my allies and who I don't view with hostility, actually. But it's not a pride I wear because other identities have emerged from class, but the class development, the development of social reproduction, was primary. And that goes down even to gender. No. We have to demand more again, not less. And what most of us are doing is demanding less. And as we do so, we fall for scams and schemes and things that redefine X into Y. MAGA communism or this, that, and the other. There's a trend here. No, it is not the same as fascism because the social conditions of fascism don't exist anymore. But it also isn't fundamentally different. The people would have been fascist if those conditions existed, if they would have survived. What we cannot cede, and what we have been ceding, is counter-systemic force. We must be making the greater demands. We must be promising to not just increase social efficiency and remove capitalism, but also remove the interference of arbitrary power and arbitrary state interventions in anyone's life. That is also a promise that we used to make and we've forgotten because of the haze of the 20th century. A regrettable century, as my friends Chris Jason named their podcast over. And is this century going to be more regrettable? So far, and saving up that way. And given the cost of our production being utilized solely for capitalist value, and for now increasingly just the seeking of rents and blatant exploitation and extraction for no other purpose than the production of capital itself. The costs really are existential. Yes, there are the trolls who will come and talk about how people who have these ideas never look like they lived anything, and I will look at their jaws and also look at their waistlines and say the same thing. I've been them some ways I still am. But the funny thing is, I believe in them. I'm not parsing an distinction. The reactionary often has the same impulses as us, but has been misguided as to where it goes and has looked for an easy fix, an easy answer to blame, and one that doesn't require a fundamental change of our lives. We have to be honest that we require a fundamental change in our lives. It's not just that we make socialism popular, is that we make it scary. Because the belief that everyone is entitled to equal say in their future and equal role and responsibility for carrying that out should terrify those with privilege, should terrify those with class power. And if it doesn't, what are you doing? As this is a Patreon-supported podcast, I have to front over to my role as a rentier. I have to thank some new $10 patrons. The irony, by the way, has never been lost on me that we live in a capitalist society and I have to treat these things capitalistically. Are though really as a rentier model. All right, I'd like to thank Nance and Bella Lugosi as Red for supporting me at the $10 a month level. I think everyone should also go watch Why is Every Communist Regime a Dictatorship, for how developmentalism became the dominant vision of communism. I have talked about this with Spencer Leonard and with Gene Bagelon as well as Daniel from what is politics, and I hope that Daniel and I have an exchange on this in the future because I fundamentally agree with most of what he says in that video. The irony is now that we're talking about peasant questions and this, that, and the other in a time where those don't exist most any place in the developed world and fewer places in the developing world. Anyway, you can find the link in the show notes. Check it out. And remember, limiting your imagination eventually is treason to the future.